Epilogue: History and Liberty. In Shakespeare's drama Hamlet, the hero is a virtuous man who is rightly shocked by the abrupt rise of an evil ruler. Haunted by visions, overcome by nightmares, lonely and estranged, he feels that he must reconstruct his sense of time. "The time is out of joint," says Hamlet, "O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right." Our time is certainly out of joint. We have forgotten history for one reason, and if we are not careful, we will neglect it for another. We will have to repair our own sense of time if we wish to renew our commitment to liberty. Until recently, we Americans had convinced ourselves that there was nothing in the future but more of the same. The seemingly distant traumas of fascism, Nazism, and communism seemed to be receding into irrelevance. We allowed ourselves to accept the politics of inevitability, the sense that history could move in only one direction, toward liberal democracy. After communism in Eastern Europe came to an end in 1989 to 91, we imbibed the myth of an end of history. In doing so, we lowered our defenses, constrained our imagination, and opened the way for precisely the kinds of regimes we told ourselves could never return. To be sure, the politics of inevitability seems at first glance to be a kind of history. Inevitability politicians do not deny that there is a past, a present, and a future. They even allow for colorful variety of the distant past. Yet they portray the present simply as a step toward a future that we already know. One of expanding globalization, deepening reason, and growing prosperity. This is what is called a teleology, a narration of time that leads towards a certain, usually desirable goal. Communism also offered a teleology, promising an inevitable socialist utopia. When that story was shattered a quarter of a century ago, we drew the wrong conclusion. Rather than rejecting teleologies, we imagined that our own story was true. The politics of inevitability is self-induced intellectual coma. So long as there was a contest between communist and capitalist systems, and so long as the memory of fascism and Nazism was alive, Americans had to pay some attention to history and preserve the concepts that allowed them to imagine alternative futures. Yet, once we accepted the politics of inevitability, we assumed that history was no longer relevant. If everything in the past is governed by a known tendency, then there's no need to learn the details. The acceptance of inevitability stilted the way we talk about politics in the 21st century. It stifled policy debate and tended to generate party systems where one political party defended the status quo while the other party proposed total negation. We learned to say that there was no alternative to the basic order of things, a sensibility that the Lithuanian political theorist Leonidas Donskis called liquid evil. Once the inevitability was taken for granted, criticism indeed became slippery. What appeared to be critical analysis often assumed that the status quo could not actually change, and thereby indirectly reinforced it. Some spoke critically of neoliberalism, the sense that the idea of the free market has somehow crowded out all others. This was true enough, but the very use of the word was usually only a kowtow before an unchangeable hegemony. Other critics spoke of the need for disruption, borrowing a term from the analysis of technological innovations. When applied to politics, it again carries the implication that nothing can really change, that the chaos that excites us will eventually be absorbed by a self-regulating system. The man who runs naked across a football field certainly disrupts, but he does not change the rules of the game. The whole notion of disruption is adolescent. It assumes that after the teenager makes a mess, the adults will come and clean it up. But there are no adults. We own this mess. The second anti-historical way of considering the past is the politics of eternity. Like the politics of inevitability, the politics of eternity performs a masquerade of history, though a different one. It is concerned with the past, but in a self-absorbed way, free of any real concern with facts. Its mood is a longing for past moments that never really happened, during epochs that were in fact disastrous. Eternity politicians bring us the past as a vast, misty courtyard of illegible monuments to national victimhood, all of them equally distant from the present, all of them equally accessible for manipulation. Every reference to the past seems to invoke an attack by some external enemy upon the purity of the nation. National populists are eternity politicians. Their preferred reference point is an era when democratic republics seemed vanquished and their Nazi and Soviet rivals unstoppable, the 1930s. Those who advocated Brexit, the departure of the United Kingdom from the European Union, imagined a British nation-state, though such a thing never existed. There was a British Empire, and then there was Britain as a member of the European Union. The move to separate from the EU is not a step backward onto firm ground, but a leap into the unknown. Eerily, when judges said that a parliamentary vote was required for Brexit, a British tabloid called them enemies of the people, a Stalinist term used for the show trials of the 1930s. The National Front in France urges voters to reject Europe in the name of an imaginary pre-war French nation-state. But France, like Britain, has never existed without either an empire or a European project. Leaders of Russia, Poland, and Hungary alike make similar gestures toward a glowing image of the 1930s. In his 2016 campaign, the American president used the slogan, "America First," which is the name of a committee that sought to prevent the United States from opposing Nazi Germany. The president's strategic advisor promises policies that will be as exciting as in the 1930s. And when exactly was the again in the president's slogan, "Make America Great Again"? Hint, it is the same again that we find in "Never Again." The president himself has described a regime change in the style of the 1930s as the solution to the problems of the present. You know what solves it, he said? When the economy crashes, when the country goes to total hell and everything is a disaster. What we need, he thinks, are riots to go back to where we used to be, when we were great. In the politics of eternity, the seduction by a mythicized past prevents us from thinking about possible futures. The habit of dwelling on victimhood dulls our impulse for self-correction. Since the nation is defined by its inherent virtue rather than by its future potential, politics becomes a discussion of good and evil rather than a discussion of possible solutions to real problems. Since the crisis is permanent, the sense of emergency is always present. Planning for the future seems impossible or even disloyal. How can we even think of reform when the enemy is always at the gate? The politics of inevitability is like a coma. The politics of eternity is like hypnosis. We stare at a spinning vortex of cyclical myth until we fall into a trance, and then we do something shocking at someone else's orders. The danger we now face of a passage from the politics of inevitability to the politics of eternity, from a naive and flawed sort of democratic republic to a confused and cynical sort of fascist oligarchy. The politics of inevitability is terribly vulnerable to the kind of shock it has just received. When something shatters the myth, when our time falls out of joint, we scramble to find some other way to organize what we experience. The path of least resistance leads directly from inevitability to eternity. If you once believed that everything will always turn out well in the end, you can then be persuaded that nothing turns out well in the end. If you once did nothing because you thought progress is inevitable, then you can continue to do nothing because you think time moves in repeating cycles. Both of these positions, inevitability and eternity, are anti-historical. The only thing that stands between them is history itself. History allows us to see patterns and make judgments. It sketches for us the structures within which we seek freedom. It reveals moments, each one of them different, none entirely unique. To understand one moment is to see the possibility of being the co-creator of another. History permits us to be responsible, not for everything, but for something. The Polish poet Czesław Miłosz thought that such a notion of responsibility worked against loneliness and indifference. History gives us the company of those who have done and suffered more than we have. By embracing the politics of inevitability, we raised a generation without history. How will these young Americans react now that the promise of inevitability has been so obviously broken? Perhaps we will slide from inevitability toward eternity. It must be hoped that they could, instead, become a historical generation, rejecting the traps of inevitability and eternity that older generations have laid before them. One thing is certain: if young people do not begin to make history, politicians of eternity and inevitability will destroy it. To make history, young Americans will have to know more. This is not the end, but the beginning. The time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right. Thus Hamlet. Yet he concludes, nay, come, let's go together.